Good evening, everyone. I'm very happy to be here with you tonight. For those of you who are already well-versed in the world of terrorism and jihadism studies, our guest tonight does not actually require an introduction, but I will give it to him anyway, for those of you who may not know. We have Dr. Aaron Zelen with us here tonight, and he is a Richard Burrow Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. He's also the founder of a widely used website, Jihadology, and did a podcast associated with that, which is definitely worth listening to, especially these days when we have lots of podcast time. And he's been the author of a number of different papers that look at ISIS, foreign fighting, online extremism, as well as jihadi governance. We're here tonight to talk about his excellent book, Your Sons Are at Your Service, Tunisia's Missionaries of Jihad. It was published with Columbia University Press late last year. And it's a terrific book. It's really the authoritative book on a country that doesn't get as much attention as a lot of other countries in the MENA region. It doesn't get as much attention, even though it was the country that sparked the Arab Spring in 2011 and really was the only country who emerged from those revolutions with a democracy. And prior to 2011, it had not seen much terrorism within its borders. But yet when ISIS swept through Iraq and Syria, there were a surprising number of Tunisians who joined the organization. So there's a lot that remains a puzzle about Tunisia. So it's really a fantastic project and a fantastic book that Aaron has put together that really explains some of the long-term causes that underpin what we saw from Tunisians since the Arab Spring, and especially in terms of being recruited by ISIS. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Aaron. You're welcome to put questions in the Q&A function throughout his talk, and then when he concludes, I'll come back on and pose some of the great questions I'm sure we're going to get for him. So with that, thank you for coming, Aaron, and we're so happy to have you here tonight.
Thanks for having me, and I appreciate you putting this on. It's too bad we weren't able to do it in person like we originally planned back in late March, but here we are. Hopefully I can do some other events in the future at AU in person whenever we get a vaccine. So I'm going to just start a slide here and talk about my book now. So let's see. Might help to do the share button instead of just doing it on my own screen by myself. All right, cool. Here we go. So there are a lot of details in this book, which, I won't be able to get to just in a short period. So for those who are interested in more details, I definitely recommend you getting a copy because there's a lot of history to get through. But when you think of Tunisian jihadis or events related to them, what might you think about when you're talking about it? I imagine for most people, it's probably you're imagining something along these lines, essentially Tunisians that joined up with ISIS, the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. Others, when they think about it, they might think of other events, whether it's the attack on the US Embassy in Tunis on the top left, the attack on the Bordeaux Museum in Tunis in March 2015 on the right, and then the Sousse Beach attack in June 2015, later that year on the bottom left. But for me, this all really started with this. This was a forum post that was on the jihadi forums back in May 2011, announcing that there was this new group called Ansar al-Sharia starting there, and that they're planning on doing an inaugural forum a couple of days later. And this was quite surprising just because, at least at that point, most people always talked about Tunisia being this relatively secular country compared to other Arab states. And even its Islamist group there, Ennahda, is relatively moderate compared to most Muslim Brotherhood-like groups. So when I started to do this research, which was originally based off of my PhD, I wanted to explain why jihadism became such a force in Tunisia and amongst Tunisians following the January 2011 revolution. Of course, later when I turned it from a dissertation into an actual book, I added 3 extra chapters sort of about the most recent dynamics related to ISIS, since the PhD was only up until the end of 2013. And to do this, I use a number of sources to try and get at the background history, because There was a lot going on if you look at it prior to 2011. So I was able to go back to a number of old Arabic biographies and magazines that were written by jihadis in the 1980s and 1990s and combing through them to see any mentions or details related to Tunisians. I also had an access to a number of different court documents in Europe as well as the United States related to Tunisians that had been involved in terrorist plotting and attacks there. Since many Tunisians that had been involved prior to 2011 did so in Europe instead of actually within Tunisia itself due to the authoritarian environment within Tunisia prior to the revolution. I also had the opportunity to go to Tunisia a number of times in 2012 and 13 initially, but then also in 2018 and 19 again when I was turning the dissertation into the book. And I was able to go to these demonstrations that Ansar al-Sharia put on. I went to their mosques. I was able to get their dawah literature that they, handed out in person. You couldn't get online. I was able to go to the mosques that they were in and sort of see what was going on there. I talked to a returned foreign fighter as well as members of the group too. And you could really get the feeling there that they weren't afraid, that they're out in the open, and the brazenness of it. And this slide here is a good example of this, where it says Obama, Obama, Kulna Osama, or Obama, Obama, we're all Osama bin Laden, of course. And therefore, unlike, in most environments where guys that were, essentially Al-Qaeda were openly just talking about their ideology and recruiting people, it was a very different environment with what was going on. In addition to the fieldwork, I supplemented this with a number of primary sources from Ansar al-Sharia, as well as with the Islamic State and other groups that were relevant. And I always found this picture really interesting and meta in some ways because, part of the propaganda experts was to get information out about what they're doing, but it's a picture of somebody taking a picture of their caravan to provide some relief to people in different rural areas. So Tunisian jihadis were highly involved in jihadism prior to the 2011 revolution, unbeknownst to most people, since much of it happened outside of Tunisia, actually. From the anti-Soviet jihad, and here's the first martyrdom notice of a Tunisian that died in Afghanistan in the 1980s, to a terrorist attack in Mali, Tunisians have been involved with the jihadi movement for 30 years prior to the Tunisian uprising. What's interesting is that in the beginning, they weren't quite as organized as we would see after 2011. So back in the late 80s, early 90s, Abu Musab al-Suri, one of the key ideologues in the movement of the jihadi movement in general, noted about Tunisians in Afghanistan, quote, "Unfortunately, and despite having many faithful and good members among them, the reputation of the Tunisian brothers among the Mujahideen groups in general became that of a scattered group with a less than perfect image," end quote. But they're not mere footnotes over time within the broader movement. They play key roles as foreign fighters in Afghanistan, Bosnia, Algeria, and Iraq. They're also key cogs in logistics, facilitation, and a recruitment networks based in Europe, operating mainly out of Milan, but also in Paris, Brussels, as well as London. Tunisians had various leading and support roles in large-scale attacks, including the 1998 embassy bombings, the Ahmed Shah Massoud assassination, 9/11, the Jerba synagogue bombings, the Casablanca bombings, and the Madrid train bombings, as well as many thwarted plots. And the top statement in the middle was the first claimed attack ever within Tunisia by the GIA in 1995 during the Algerian Civil War, where they attacked a border post of Tunisian guards. And then the bottom one is the message that was faxed to Al-Hayat and Al-Quds Al-Arabi after Al-Qaeda claimed responsibility for the Jerba synagogue bombing in April 2002. The number of Tunisian foreign fighters, especially those that fought in Iraq or were involved in the logistics facilitation and recruitment for it, help explain why so many Tunisian foreign fighters later, and what we see more recently, joined the fight in Syria in the past few years. In many ways, there's been this through line between how the historical movement evolved and how that affected the growth of both Ansar al-Sharia, but then later the Islamic State. And many central key figures in AST and then IS gained a bevy of experiences over this time, such as Saif Allah bin Hassin, better known as Abu Ayyad al-Tunisi, and the founder of AST, as well as other figures such as Sami Yassid bin Khamis, Mahdi Kamoun, Muaz al-Fazani, Hassan al-Brik, Bubakar al-Hakim, Tariq al-Harzi, Sabri Yassid, Mohammed Bakhti, and Wanas al-Faqih. And if you want to get more details on a lot of these figures and their histories and what they're doing over time, it's all in the book. And within this presentation, I'll probably mainly be talking about somebody like Abu Ayyad al-Tunisi, since he was the main leader. So between 2003 and 2010, there was a growth in the prisoner population within Tunisia itself as a result of deportations and extraditions from the Iraq Jihad, as well as people being returned back to Tunisia from Europe, as well as local arrests in the decade prior to the uprising connected to, and this helped connect different generations of Tunisian jihadis from the first generation that got involved more in Afghanistan in the 80s and the European networks in the 90s, versus those in the second generation more coming of age during the Iraq Jihad after the US invasion in 2003, as well as the growth of AQIM's networks in Algeria and North Africa in the latter half of the 2000s, the first decade of 2000s. And this provided new opportunities for people then to share experiences, lessons learned, and preparations for potential post-release. Therefore, the opportunity for a golden age of jihadism at home was ripe, but it was not necessarily guaranteed to succeed or proliferate as much as it did. Those in prison began to plan what they're doing when they got out, when members of Ennahda got out in 2006 during the 50th anniversary of Tunisia's independence. Again, Ennahda is the main Islamist party there. This was sort of a goodwill gesture of Ben Ali at the time, who's the former leader of Tunisia. And so 5 years prior to the revolution, sort of this proto-AST element within prison, we're starting to plan what they might do. And I was able to find this out because I talked to one of the 20 founding members of this organization within the prison. And in relation to this, Abu Ayyad noted, quote, "I consider the period of imprisonment as one of the best periods of my life in the matter of knowledge seeking and jihad," end quote. And unlike in, say, Egypt, Libya, or Morocco, we didn't see any ideological revisions going on within the Tunisian jihadi movement in the prison during this time. Therefore, Abu Ayyad would describe this, quote, as a merit for the jihadi current in Tunisia, end quote, which allowed it to remain true to its ideology, unlike what we saw in other countries during the 2000s. Therefore, when what I call the original sin of the revolution happened, which is essentially what's on this slide here, it's the general prisoner amnesty, which happened following the revolution, which allowed all prisoners to leave the prison no matter what they're in prison for. Obviously, I'm totally for political prisoners going out, but I do think that there could have been a better process to maybe under the new system and through the rule of law, retry people instead of just letting out people that were battle-hardened jihadis. The transitional government's lack of oversight of this prisoner population, combined with the pressure from revolutionaries below, released many of these individuals with experiences back out onto the streets. And among them was around 1,200 jihadis, including 300 who had previously fought in Afghanistan, Iraq, Yemen, and Somalia. In addition to this, the transitional government maintained little legitimacy and primarily at this time focused on preparing the country for its forthcoming constituent assembly elections, which would occur in October 2011. This sort of provided the initial space for AST to formally organize itself and spread its ideas to gain new followers. And following the elections, the Ennahda-led government, this Islamist group that I was talking about, became more engaged in the transitional government on how to deal with AST, but its gamble on what I call a light touch policy failed. As an illustration of this, Hamadi al-Jabali, the Tunisian prime minister at the time and a senior member of Ennahda, went so far as to say, quote, "They are sons of Tunisia and they're not from Mars," end quote. Therefore, AST successfully exploited Ennahda's soft approach to further recruit, embed itself within society, and challenge the secular left intellectuals and artists, as well as eventually the Islamic legitimacy of Ennahda itself. Part of the reason why Ennahda did this was based off of their own experience of being cracked down upon by the Ben Ali regime in the late 1980s and early 1990s, and they felt that this would potentially lead to a further radicalization of violence within Tunisia after the revolution, since there was violence by members of Ennahda during the original crackdown. And they also were thinking that, look, we're here now 15 years later, essentially, and we're the ones who are now in control of the country. So do you want Al-Qaeda essentially to be in control in another 15 years? which is interesting now thinking about it because that'd be in 2025, which is only less than 5 years from now. But nonetheless, this was sort of the rationale for why they decided on this approach. In addition to this, AST decided on a Dawah-first approach itself instead of a jihad-first approach, based off of lessons learned from the Iraq Jihad and the excessive violence there with Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, as well as the particular conditions within Tunisia itself. Abu Ayyad noted, quote, "All our actions are now summarized in moral preaching and works of charity. I am convinced that Tunisia is not a land of jihad, but is a land of religious preaching," end quote. Abu Ayyad's realization that individuals needed to be educated in the true understanding of Islam, according to AST, of course, before Tunisia would be ripe for jihad. The Dawah-first approach allowed AST to reach a broader audience than if it had been sort of this classic clandestine style organization that Al-Qaeda had historically been in. And, in the initial research that I was doing, I ended up writing an article about this for foreign policy at the time, sort of talking about these changes that Al-Qaeda was making in the advice they're giving to different groups after the uprisings, and sort of how it's being implemented in the context of Tunisia, because unlike, say, Libya or Syria or Yemen, it wasn't a civil war. There was a legitimate transition, and there was actual democracy being practiced. And interestingly enough, AST themselves translated the article into Arabic. And unlike, a lot of times where jihadis might say something negative about, some American writing about their group and saying something nasty about them, they actually just said, here's a report from an American researcher. So I figured that, if they're reposting this, maybe I was on the right, path in terms of understanding what was truly going on and the changes that were being made in the post-Arab uprising era in relation to sort of Al-Qaeda and what they're attempting to do. So what did AST do here? In the 2.5-year period that the group was actually legal, from May 2011 to the end of August 2013, when the group was designated as a terrorist organization by the Tunisian government, they did upwards up to about 900 total discrete activities. And you could see on the slide here that it wasn't just like in a specific city or just in like the capital in Tunis, but it was all over the country, in the coast, in the rural areas, in the large cities and smaller areas. And therefore they had a wide swath of support amongst a varying group of people. Its activities are characterized by a number of opportunities for individuals to become involved, whether through outreach, religious education, or charitable and relief type efforts. In many respects, the charity and service activities were in the service of spreading the group's ideology. And I'll get to that in a second, but first, I thought I'd show some examples of what I mean here. So here's an example of a post that they would put online to say, look, we're doing this event. Here's a number, contact us to get involved in this. And then second is the pictures that they would post online and videos too about what they would actually do after the fact, because it would show not only that they had a good organization and that they're talking the talk, but they're walking the walk too. And this is an example of one of their relief caravans where it would start in a bigger city or town and go to a smaller rural area. In addition to this, this is an example of one of their annual conferences. As you could see, they were not too shy about showing off who they were and what they were about. Similarly, this is one of the regular types of outdoor forums that they would do in different villages and cities. And again, quite brazen. They weren't worried about what people might think, and the fact that guys that believe in Al-Qaeda's ideology were just openly able to proselytize, recruit, and push its message like this at that time. In addition to this, they're in control of a number of mosques, and the mosques also acted as a key mobilizing resource in terms of being able to plan a lot of their events, as well as the sort of packages that they would give to people, whether it was medicines, food, clothing, what have you. And as you can see in the top middle photo, they also put their official local magazine in there, as well as some other literature as well, which then provided the impetus for people to learn more about it that might only be receiving the aid because they might be needy, and therefore potentially expanding the scope of who would be a follower of the group. In addition to this, they also had demonstrations, usually in front of parliament or the interior ministry or some foreign ministries. And as you can see on the right side, women were involved in these activities too. And this is important to note just because as we saw later on with ISIS, there are a lot more women involved in the activities there, and many Tunisian women were involved in this. I'll get into that briefly in a little bit, but a lot of the stuff we saw with AST in terms of this social services, pro-governance type activity, in many ways is a precursor. Again, we have to remember this is 2011 to 2013, before all of these developments we saw with the reemergence of ISIS in 2013 to 15 time period, more or less. So returning to sort of the messaging of the group and the pursuit of the ideology, it helped that AST's message resonated with many individuals that are looking for something new post-revolution, but especially those that became disillusioned by the slow process of democracy and the transition. So since you could see sort of the tangible activities that AST was doing through its social media campaign compared to sort of the arguments going on within the capital while they're writing the constitution in Tunis. And one of the key ideas that they proffered was this idea of brotherhood. And as an example, an AST member once explained how one of his friends joined the group, and he said, quote, "One day he came to me to understand what was this special feeling that we shared. We are more than friends, we are brothers. We share ethics, and between us there is special strength and solidarity," end quote. And when I met AST members, they actually did dow on me myself. And I could see as an outsider why someone that was local might be captivated by their message, because they're also very nice and warm in the way that they tried to go about it. And this is also part of the reason why I chose the title of my book, or at least the first half of it, "Your Sons Are at Your Service," which was one of the slogans that AST used, so that it had this power involved in many ways, that it not only provide this message towards those involved in the activities and that they're doing something on behalf of their community, but also to show the community that they are there and that they should be proud of them in many respects. Another message that they used was this idea of defending God and Islam. Obviously not too surprising considering the ideologies of these groups. I don't need to get into that too much since it's self-explanatory. Another important message, and again, we should think about this 2011 to 13, before all of the ISIS stuff really popped off again in the caliphate announcement, was this idea of building an Islamic state. And the second annual conference, which is the top left graphic above, one of the slogans related to it was a building block in the project to establish the caliphate state. This is in 2012. And then in the bottom right is a screenshot of pictures that they were posting of events. This is just the top of it. And this was after the third annual conference in 2013, and they started assigning the sort of saying the Islamic State we are building to different events that they're conducting at the time. So you could see that these ideas that are going on in Tunisia with AST in many ways helped prime what we would see later on. And therefore, it's not quite as surprising why the messages that ISIS would do would be so appealing. And even more so, the final idea that sort of proffered by AST in sort of these broader categories, since obviously they had other messages too, was this idea of Duat Allah Bakia, or the call of God remains. And this is after the government started cracking down on the group. And for those that follow ISIS, obviously one of their slogans is Bakia wa Tatamaddad, or remaining and expanding. So you could see that, again, there's sort of this similarities in some ways in what was going on. And all of these messages provided an individual with a purpose that both benefited himself and encouraged solidarity amongst the group members by helping them believe they are fulfilling God's promise and bettering their communities. This incentivized individuals to remain active and encourage new members to join, even when the group came under the threat from the state. There are a number of interrelated processes, though, that contributed to the fall of AST as an organizational presence in Tunisia, and sort of the return of foreign fighting as a key method of Tunisian jihadi activism. In the end, Abu Ayyad was unable to manage what he described as the stages between dawah and jihad, which allowed for growth and violence, even if the original intent was his dawah first approach. As he once noted, quote, "In this period, we are in the dawah phase without abandoning jihad as an obligation," end quote. The reality is that jihadi ideology is inherently violent, even if they want to try a more nonviolent approach. And we've seen this not just in the case of Tunisia, but more akin with a number of these sort of dawah-like groups that popped up in Europe in the 2000s as well, that eventually led to a number of figures within those groups getting involved in violence. And we saw sort of this happening, whether it was with the Nesma TV riots, and on the top left is a graphic that was promoting the original demonstrations related to Nesma TV, showing God in human form in the Persepolis film at the time, which led to riots. Whether it was the Manuba College niqab protests, where members of the group held the dean of the school hostage. And you can see here, they're trying to show their force in front of the campus on the lower left. And I actually had the opportunity to interview the dean of the school, and he showed me a number of things that were going on at the time and documents related to sort of administrative issues related to the students involved in some of these activities. And then on the top, on the right side, is the Avenue Bourguiba Sharia show of strength, which is when there was this debate about whether Sharia should be part of the Constitution or not. And AST wanted to obviously show its support for this, even if they don't even believe in the Constitution. But it inevitably actually led to Ennahda withdrawing the potential of this, because there's so much pressure against them by more of the secular and conservative nationalist types that were against this due to what we saw on this day. And that's part of the reason why the cover of my book came from this picture, for those who could see my small box on the Zoom call. And then in addition to this, this got even worse over time with the attack on the US Embassy, which I alluded to earlier in the presentation. And these are pictures from the inside from one of the jihadists involved in the attack, as well as then later the assassination in February and July 2013 of two secular leftist politicians. Plus, AST allowed for its members to be involved in sort of Hizb-related intimidation and tactics and assault, essentially moral policing, policing people that were drinking alcohol or not fasting during Ramadan, or women wearing scantily clad clothing, or men and women, socializing together, things like that. And this was part of AST establishing what they originally called security committees, but it then renamed them neighborhood committees, maybe to make it seem more benign, which further encouraged sort of this vigilante spirit. You could see on the bottom sort of these marauding group of individuals that were involved at night, walking around and sort of patrolling as sort of this shadow actor within different parts of Tunisia. And as you can see, at least in the middle picture, there are people with like clubs and other things, and people were beat up, and I think one person actually died in one of the attacks. So as a result, while Ennahda initially situated itself as a moderating force between what it saw as the secular extremism on the left and the Salafi extremism on the right, mounting AST-related violence in the country, paired with critiques from the left about Ennahda's complicity, forced the party to take the issue more seriously. And in the aftermath of AST's third annual conference in May 2013, Abu Ayyad released a message mocking Ennahda for allowing AST to proselytize openly in the first place, because this was the first times where we started to see the government more forcefully going against the group openly. And Abu Ayyad said at the time, quote, "Our religion taught us to thank those who is worthy of being thanked, and you, Ennahda, today are the most worthy of people to be thanked, since you committed stupidities that were the reason for the spread of our dawah," end quote. And a few days later, the leader of Ennahda, Rashid al-Ghanouchi, responded by saying, quote, "Wherever those jihadis, the Kharijites of this age are, there's destruction and ruin. I challenge them to give me one state where those reckless people have succeeded. Are Somalia, Iraq, or Afghanistan stable countries?" End quote. This speech in many ways illustrates Ennahda's shift in views and public descriptions of AST. By this time, many Tunisians involved in the jihadi movement were already leaving to go to Libya, Iraq, and Syria. And part of this was also due to the government's ineffectiveness at this time to stop people, even if they knew the dangers. So at the time, the Interior Minister, Ali Rayed, who also was a member of Ennahda, asserted, quote, "We deplore these young people going on misadventures. We are watching these things closely," end quote. Larayed himself later admitted there were few preventative mechanisms in place. He said, quote, "We cannot legally prevent a citizen from leaving the country if he says he is leaving for work or tourism," end quote. And although Abu Ayyad at the time had this strategy of dawah at home, he also called for jihad abroad. So in February 2013, for example, Abu Ayyad said, "Tunisians can be found everywhere in the land of jihad. The ways of going are easy. We don't stop our people from leaving," end quote. And in my own experience at AST mosques, I saw members of the group doing special duat or blessings after their normal prayers for the mujahideen in Bilad al-Sham, which is just a reference to Syria and what they're doing there. In addition, in the propaganda of AST, this was being pushed as well. So on the top left is the graphic for a release of a nasheed for Abu Muhammad al-Jalani, who was the leader of Jabhat al-Nusra at the time, signs supporting Jabhat al-Nusra, and martyrdom notices for Tunisians that had already gone to Syria and fought abroad and died there. However, following the fall of AST, with the designation of the group in late August 2013, the jihadi movement changed a bit. No longer was it this cohesive entity that was run by Tunisians and was primarily focused on Tunisia, but again, it became more globalized by big brand groups like the Islamic State. Once again, Tunisian jihadism returned to a historical norm, one characterized by foreign fighting, as well as individuals involved in facilitating and plotting attacks in Europe in particular. But because of the historical nature of the Tunisians' connections during the Iraq Jihad, this helped them mobilize later for what we saw in Syria. It's also important to note, even though many Tunisians ended up joining up with ISIS in Iraq and Syria, that we shouldn't necessarily project our understanding of the split between Al-Qaeda and ISIS back into this time period, because again, AST was an Al-Qaeda front group at the time. The current war between AQ and ISIS should not be used as a lens to understand this, because you know, all this stuff happening in 2013 was only around the time that ISIS initially went into Syria. And at the time, there's sort of this truce between ISIS and Jabhat al-Nusra, and there wasn't this overt enmity with Al-Qaeda either until Al-Qaeda put out its statement in February 2014, ultimately disavowing them. And therefore, Abu Ayyad put out a statement in the summer of 2013 saying that AST announces that it has not officially declared its position regarding the disagreement between ISIS and Jabhat al-Nusra, and therefore this provided sort of this vacuum for people to decide on their own or be influenced by others within AST's leadership. And this included people like Abu Ja'far al-Hattab, Kamal Zarruq, Bilal Shawashi, and Abu Bakr al-Hakim, who all promoted ISIS. Plus, IS's dawah activities and messaging resonated based on their past experiences with AST. And Tunisians helped originally build IS's dawah program that were involved in building this up in Syria. There's this figure named Abu Waqas al-Tunisi who became the face of IS's dawah program, appearing in at least 6 of its videos by the end of just 2013. Therefore, these ideas would resonate with many AST recruits who felt that their mission in Tunisia had only just begun and that they would eventually spread their dawah globally. And according to an AST member I interviewed back in 2013, he said, quote, "The dawah is going on, and then after it is global work, not just in Tunisia," end quote. It's no surprise then that ISIS's Voice of Asham magazine in September 2013 featured a picture of Abu Waqas al-Tunisi with the Quranic verse 49:10, "The believers are but brothers," next to him. And this is the graphic on the bottom, and Abu Waqas is the individual in the middle there, which is the same slogan that AST used, which is the graphic above it, which says "The believers are but brothers" as well. And because they had the same framing devices, you could see how this attracted followers to ISIS. And while this soft touch approach appealed to some, a more extreme approach attracted others, especially after Ennahda's crackdown, which radicalized a number of Tunisians to become even more extreme than sort of what we saw with Al-Qaeda's ideology. Tunisians became involved with an ultra-extremist trend within ISIS called the Hazamis, which is named after Ahmed bin Umar al-Hazmi, a Saudi religious scholar that believes in chain takfir, or excommunication, essentially, which means that if you yourself are not doing takfir on somebody that isn't a true Muslim, then you yourself, get excommunicated, and therefore your blood is legitimate too. So it's just this never-ending chain reaction if you don't do that as well. Hazmi actually toured Tunisia after the revolution. He did 4 different lecture series, as well as opened up the Ibn Zayd al-Qayrawani Institute for Sharia Sciences between December 2011 and May 2012, in coordination with AST's cleric Abu Muhannad al-Tunisi. Hazmi's works were also part of AST's curriculum, and you could see that on the left side, which they posted online, different lectures that you can pick up, as well as CDs in person. This exposure to ultra extremism, especially for people like Abu Jafar al-Hattab and other Tunisians, led them to eventually even question Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the leader of ISIS at the time. And as a result, many were eventually executed in Syria. But it does likely explain in some part some of the violent incidents that Tunisians were involved with in Syria as well. For example, Hamza al-Maghrawi, or Abu Bilal al-Tunisi, was involved in the capturing, torture, and idea for burning the Jordanian pilot Muaz al-Qasasba alive. Additionally, the founder of the infamous female-led Al-Khansa Brigade, which essentially was a women's Hizbah patrol, was founded by the Tunisian woman Rayyan al-Tunisi, who eventually also then moved from Raqqa in Syria to Sirte in Libya to help build it up in IS Libya as well. I think I'll leave it here just so I have some time for questions and answers. There's obviously a lot more in the book on the historical angle, as well as the stuff related to ISIS specifically, as well as what was going on in Tunisia also after Ansar Sharia and the attacks that we saw there with the Bardo Museum, Sousse Beach attack, and the failed attempt to take over Bin Gardan. But I did want to leave some time for questions and answers. So it's my hope that this research will allow others in the field to better understand the reasons behind, Tunisian jihadis were involved with AST in Iraq, Syria, and Libya, and the underlying processes that led to it. And hopefully, people can build off it over time as well with their own ideas and maybe disagreeing with me too. So I'll just leave it at there. And I look forward to any questions, comments, feedback, what have you. So thank you.
Great, Aaron. Thank you so much. This is one of those moments where I knew this much about something, and now I'm going to leave this talk feeling like I know this much. But I need to get the rest of it, right? So you got to read the book.
Exactly. There's a ton, way too much in some ways.
This is a masterwork in understanding the jihadist movement in Tunisia, which, as I say, I think is one of the less well understood of the various movements, especially in North Africa. I think one of the questions that immediately jumped out at me, and this may be a little bit later than your book goes, but it sounds like the Tunisian government mishandled this threat at various points, kind of allowing it to become what it is. Are they doing any better in terms of managing returnees from Iraq and Syria? And is that going to be sort of another challenge for the still very shaky democracy?
Yeah, so since the crackdown on AST in late 2013, as well as a transition to more of a bureaucratic government in 2014, as well as then successive elections that have happened since, there have been 2 different parliamentary elections since then. They've done a pretty good job overall in dealing with this issue. Obviously, there are the terrorist attacks in 2015. But overall, since the beach attack, they've really done a good job in degrading the networks that were based in Libya, because it's important to remember that the attacks, the large-scale attacks that happened, were actually planned and the people trained in Libya and then went into Tunisia. And they were Tunisians themselves. So whereas all of the attacks that have happened since are mainly in mountainous areas near the Algerian border, and are only against security forces and mainly like IEDs, nothing large scale. There have been some attacks in some urban areas, but they've also mainly just focused on police and not civilians. So it's not as large of an issue now in some respects. And part of that is just because there isn't this external operations component to it. So those that are not in the mountainous regions, which are more affiliated with these historical AQIM networks, as well as then sort of a successive ISIS network. They're mainly homegrown individuals trying to find stuff online and then either doing it themselves or being guided in some ways, but it hasn't been too sophisticated. And even the activity in the mountains has been degraded severely in the last 2 years. Part of that is just better training, which has been helpful from the US, Germany, as well as Algeria. And then in terms of law enforcement, they've gotten a lot better at being discriminate about it, whereas before they previously would just like round people up that were family members or acquaintances of people, and now they're really just focusing on people involved in it. So therefore, it's not, you know, pissing people off, I guess you could say, and therefore potentially providing an avenue for somebody else to then become radicalized because they have that grievance. In terms of returnees, I mean, the thing is that there have been 1,000 people that have returned to Tunisia from Iraq, Syria, Libya. And we already saw the blowback from that in many respects in 2015. So those that are out in public, we really haven't seen too many people that have returned then get involved in trying to plot an attack. Of course, there are a number of people that have returned that have been imprisoned. And that's definitely an issue for the future, just because, as I talked about in the book, at least prior to 2011, that was a great place for them to organize and plan. And we've obviously seen this in so many other cases, whether Camp Bucca in Iraq or sort of what happened with AQAP in Yemen before they broke out of prison, as well as some problems we've seen in some French prisons as well. So that's a worry, especially since there's overcrowding in prisons. There's no delineation between regular criminals and jihadists. And then that also creates issues if they're trying to do rehabilitation, reintegration programs, because there's these social pressures. Because similar to prisons in the US, where gangs are in control of different parts of it, jihadis run different parts of some of the prison system. So not only can it hurt things in the front end where they could potentially mobilize people that had previously been involved in regular criminality, but also hurt the back end when people that might want to get rid of their jihadi life and go back to normal life maybe, or over it or disillusioned. But it's harder to overcome those social pressures when they're still within that same area. The larger issue outside of Tunisia now is that there's still some Tunisians that are involved in foreign fighting abroad, whether it's cells that are with ISIS in Iraq and Syria. There's Tunisians that are still in Mali too, and smattering of some people in Libya, but most of the known foreign fighters abroad are mainly either imprisoned in Northeast Syria with the SDF, the Kurds, or in the IDP camps where the women and children are that were the wife or children of the actual fighters themselves. Though, as I noted, women were involved in the activities of ISIS too, and were involved in violence and moral policing, and helped cover up a lot of the slavery stuff too. So they're not being brought to justice either. So the fact that they haven't really been repatriated is obviously a problem. And Tunisia is the same dilemmas we've seen in other Western states, because it is a democracy, and a lot of the citizens don't want to bring any of them back because they're not real Tunisians, and also these guys are crazy, so we don't want them back. Essentially, I mean, it's not like a sophisticated conversation per se, but because of that, and as we know with the historical record related to the jihadi movement in general, and this doesn't just apply to Tunisians in relation to Northeast Syria now in the prisons or in the camps, but many nationalities, including Westerners, is that just leaving them out there is not a sustainable solution, whether it's in terms of people meeting each other and organizing, whether it's in terms of people becoming even more radical, or in the fact that amongst the children that are with the foreigners, many of them, at least those that are under the age of 7, have not lived a life of anything except for ISIS or being in these camps and being influenced by their mothers with that ideology. And therefore, it's not that these kids are radicalized or anything. They're just socialized into it. So it's normal for them. So it's essentially creating a whole new generation of people that grow up believing that. Of course, people can change over time, and if they grow up in something, it doesn't necessarily mean they're going to believe it. So we shouldn't necessarily securitize children, but it does create these issues the longer these kids stay within sort of this milieu over time. And similar to, you know, many Western governments, Tunisia is sort of taking the same approach, as sort of like, it's over here, arm's length type of deal. So while it's not an immediate issue, as we saw with Tunisians getting involved in the 80s and 90s, and it mainly happening outside of Tunisia, it could very well much blow back in the future. Obviously, I can't predict the future and don't know what's going to happen. But, you know, based off of the trends and what we know about this movement and what we've seen over the last 40 years, essentially, these things usually come back at some point.
Yeah. It seemed like the democratization of Tunisia featured really centrally in the post-Arab Spring development of the movement, especially compared to some other places where you saw sort of a polar opposite approach. How would you explain the Tunisian government's decision to allow AST to continue operating freely as long as it did? I mean, you mentioned the original sin, but what was sort of the calculus behind that for the Tunisian government?
I think they're worried that it would lead to more violence and a crackdown or violence within Tunisia. Also, at least Ennahda believed that former officials from the Ben Ali regime were more of a worry, and that they might try a counter coup type of thing like we saw in Egypt. And then also, they were also trying to balance with more of the secular left nationalists, many different parties that were in the opposition who were going against them. And they, I think, cynically used AST as sort of this right column where, you know, if you don't try and agree with us on some issues that are not as extreme as Al-Qaeda, then that's good for the country. But if not, then this is the alternative, essentially. Otherwise, our base is going to get more extreme. But, you know, it was naive in many respects that they thought that they could convince AST because they thought that they could eventually dialogue with them to bring them within the democratic process, even though AST had no intention of that, since they don't believe in democracy because of its course against their ideology. So it was just, it didn't make any sense. And I don't see it as sort of like negligent in the way that we saw with Gaddafi letting people out of prison on purpose to try and muck the waters, or what the Assad regime did too in the Syrian uprising, where he let out a number of Islamists and jihadists from prison, so that would then hurt the original uprisings. I just think that they had too much hubris in themselves of being able to convince AST that it was the right method to join up in the democracy process, and their own naivete that they just wouldn't listen. And finally, because of, you know, initially the embassy attack, but then really with the assassination of the politicians, that's when things got really bad, and they could no longer, you know, have some kind of illusion that these guys would change in any respects. And even in the later parts of it, you actually saw some members of AST actually attacking one of the members of Ennahda themselves physically. So it was clear that it was not just an ideational threat at that point, but also a legitimate physical threat too. But, you know, 2.5 years is a lot of time to allow people to openly proselytize. And therefore, it provided this base of people that could potentially be foreign fighters. And although only about 3,000 or so Tunisians made it to Syria, and about 1,500 made it to Libya, there were another like 27,000 or so that were stopped from going eventually. So you could see that there was a lot of people that, you know, got interested over time. And at a certain point, there may be upwards of 100,000 people involved on a normal basis in what AST was doing. So, yeah. So, I mean, but I'm sure a lot of people were mainly involved because they're interested in a lot of the charity and relief efforts than purely ideological. Because I do know some Tunisians that actually had been in AST, but once the group was designated, they're like, we don't want to get involved in any of this violence, because a lot of the members didn't realize there was sort of this clandestine aspect of AST where some members were involved in this violence. So then some people just were like, this is not my deal. And they just sort of went back into society and tried to continue with their life, but outside of sort of this jihadi activism, but just more of a private life. So,
I mean, it's a real cautionary tale of the idea, right, that there are these kinds of extreme elements that you could bring them into the political system through democracy. It shows a real failure of that whole sort of argument that some have hoped for.
Yeah, I mean, it's, you know, just like cracking down on jihadis so much like we've seen historically in Egypt, and the torture, and which led to this greater radicalization, especially in like the 60s and 70s, which led to the violence. Then in the 80s and the 90s, sort of just letting things play out is just as bad on some levels. There needs to be some calibration more in the middle, which isn't being too over the top, but also not being too light. And, you know, we've seen this play out in the UK on some level. There's a reason why people call it Londonistan, where they allowed, you know, al-Muhajirun and the jihadis there to proselytize openly for like 10 to 15 years, essentially. And we saw this to a lesser extent in, you know, Belgium and France as well over time. But definitely the UK is sort of similar in some respects. But, you know, everybody talks about all these Tunisians that became foreign fighters in Iraq and Syria. But the fact is that even though 99% of the country is Muslim, and these guys were all openly allowed to do all of this stuff, there are still only a few thousand people that actually got there, in comparison to, say, like France or Belgium. When you look at it from sort of that perspective, you know, it's not that much. Imagine if like Saudi Arabia or Egypt was just completely openly allowing jihadis to proselytize and do that for 2.5 years. Imagine how many of those people would then go off to Iraq and Syria. So the fact that it is still relatively small, I think it's important to put that in perspective, even if compared to most of the other mobilizations, a number of people from other countries was not quite as much for the most part.
Well, and it's interesting to me that in the late 1980s, 1990s, most of the other North African countries had these really well-established jihadist groups, right? And I would hear from time to time when I was working on Afghanistan, the Tunisian Combatant group, but I could never really tell how well organized that was, especially by the time I was aware of it. Was that a feeder organization for any of what we saw later in Tunisia, or was that sort of a little bit overblown?
Yeah, so the Tunisian Combatant group was founded in like 1999, 2000 during the Taliban years. It was essentially a way for Tunisians to train there to try and then do stuff back at home, similar to what we saw with other groups like Egyptians, Algerians, Libyans, etc. But it was very small. It was like maybe 30 people at most involved in it. And one of the co-founders was Abu Ayyad, who ended up becoming the founder of AST. So there is this historical through line. And I actually get into the details of the TCG in the book itself. Probably the most detailed look at what they're doing and how it's connected also to the networks in Europe and what was going on there in terms of recruitment, but also then the planning that was happening in Afghanistan, which then led to some plots that happened in Europe, I should say, pre and post 9/11. It should be noted that the TCG was the one who helped plan and execute the assassination of Ahmed Shah Massoud, two Tunisians that assassinated him. So, you know, it's a little footnote that most people don't even realize, even though it's such a large event, because he would have been the US's key ally after the US invaded in, you know, Afghanistan following 9/11. And it was on behalf of Al-Qaeda, since the TCG was a component of Al-Qaeda's broader network at the time within Afghanistan, since I believe Abu Hafs al-Masri provided some of the initial help in relation to planning it. But it was a whole network of people between the TCG in Afghanistan, as well as their network in Europe, since the Tunisians were really known for a lot of their document forgery in Europe. And therefore that allowed them to get sort of the credentials to be able to pretend like they're the press to interview Masood. So yeah, there's a whole story behind it. It's in the book too. I mean, trust me, there's a ton of stuff in the book. I obviously couldn't get into it in like 30 or 40 minutes. That's the only problem with presenting on it, is there's just so much in it that it's hard to like distill it all. So I mainly just want to talk about the AST stuff, since that's sort of, I think, the most fascinating stuff in some ways. And just because I had the opportunity to be in Tunisia when all that stuff was happening, was able to get a lot of rich data out of that too.
Yeah, that was fantastic. That's fantastic. A lot of our students are really interested in going into government, into counterterrorism. So I wonder if you had one recommendation to make to the Tunisian government about how they could counter this threat more effectively, what that would be.
I think since they are a democracy, they have a unique opportunity to harness their civil society, unlike any other country in the Middle East, where they can get citizens involved and engaged on many ways on this issue. So it's not necessarily a national level thing, since in many ways, a lot of the recruitment happens in local settings. And the fact that the Tunisian government now has a municipal government, so it's more decentralized, and it's democratic municipal elections, not just appointed people, they could really do things on a grassroots level to help veer people away from it if they're seen as having troubles, whether through social workers, psychologists, religious leaders, after school activity type of programming, just alternatives that can get people involved in different social matters. So I think that, and the government has provided some grant money to 5 different associations so far to do some pilot programming. But I think that they should focus on those things because, I think on the counterinsurgency level and on sort of the law enforcement level, they've gotten really good at that. It's more sort of this longer term issue. In addition to that aspect, which one could maybe call sort of CVE adjacent or like, 2 other things is continue to reform the judiciary in terms of, being able to prosecute people correctly and putting that information out transparently to the public so they know what's going on. So it doesn't seem like they're just willy-nilly arresting people. And then also doing more security sector reform related to prisons and, potential abuses related to torture, or even, the police themselves. While they are definitely better than the pre-2011 era, there's still, some abuses that go on. And we obviously know that from our own country. So it's, that happens there too on some level. So, those types of things I think help out and are good steps that will be beneficial and likely would see results from that more in the medium to longer term. It's something immediate, but it's, I think, really important to do. But generally speaking, I mean, you got to applaud Tunisia considering the fact how dire many people viewed things, not only with AST being able to sort of just be around openly and harassing people, but also, the fact that ISIS almost took over one of the major southern cities in 2016, and they're able to beat them back. And that sort of was a turning point in many respects. But the fact that things seem pretty good these days, you got to tip your cap to Tunisia in that regard. And the fact that they did want to do it the right way and learn and actually, get the proper advice and training from other countries that have experiences, and to do it in a way that would be, efficient, beneficial, and helpful, and not just sort of in a more corrupt manner like we see with other countries, like say maybe Egypt or Pakistan or something. Whereas the Tunisians have actually taken the money and training and put it towards the correct resources. And you could see the difference in just less than 4 years from 2016 until now. So I really do respect them for that. And I hope that they can continue on this, and hopefully there can be even more liaising and learning between the US and Tunisia, since they are a democratic country, and therefore it's easier to work with on some levels, since they do share some values because of the democratic nature of their society now.
I'll wrap up with a final question from one of the scholars at the University of Alabama who works on policing. I think you piqued her interest when you mentioned the effectiveness of their policing and counterterrorism. Are there certain approaches that you've seen the Tunisians take in terms of their policing that have worked particularly well in countering terrorism?
I think it's more just that they've been able to use more data, more predictive policing, but also getting better intelligence. So if somebody is involved with something, they're actually doing like serious interrogations instead of just throwing somebody away or torturing them or what have you. So they're getting better leads on things, and they're having more sophisticated databases on who's been involved previously, now, and maybe who's like abroad and therefore is a worry. So they have better information with what's going on. And I also think that the FBI through the embassy has been able to provide some helpful training too, just in terms of like the forensics of cases and stuff. And, you know, one of the things that I would love to see eventually, which hopefully they would do, though easier said than done, since a lot of the Tunisian government still isn't digitized, which is crazy to think in 2020. A lot of it's paper trail, but is that similar to the US, you know, when there's an arrest, they put out an indictment online, and it would be great if Tunisia was be able to do something like that, because not only would show the transparency to the local public, but also be great for research purposes too, which obviously I'm a little biased on that front. But because of that, you know, it could really show the sophistication and maturity of the Tunisian system, and also be a good example to other people, because even in European countries, they don't really put that information out there publicly in the same way that the US does. I mean, it's sort of out there, but you kind of have to know the right people to get access to it, or find the right place to get it. So hopefully, you know, there's more development of that sophistication on that level, especially between law enforcement too, then, and then also the judiciary.
Well, the hour flew by, and I know there's a lot more that people can get out of your book. So I encourage, again, the Columbia University, Your Sons at Your Service, available on Amazon and Barnes and Nobles, or wherever you get your books these days. So I definitely encourage you to get Aaron's book and to read. He's got many publications that are worth your while if you want to understand the current jihadist sphere. So Aaron, thank you very much for coming virtually. I look forward to actually hosting you at American when that's a thing we can do again. But
that would be great.
Yeah, that'll be fantastic. I look forward to that.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. All right, everybody, have a great night.